They met in the heart of a bustling market, amid the chatter of bargaining voices, the aroma of freshly fried snacks, and the warm glow of a setting sun. It was the kind of meeting that felt written in the stars. Edward, with his quiet determination and gentle smile, had always believed in love. And Anna, with her effortless grace and contagious laugh, seemed like the answer to every unspoken dream each ever dared to hold close. From that moment, their lives intertwined. Morning conversations over steaming cups of tea turned into late-night walks under the stars. Anna loved how Edward's eyes lit up when he talked about his art, how he poured himself into every stroke of the brush, crafting a world he hoped they'd share. And Edward adored Anna's fiery way of making even the mundane feel extraordinary. Together, they were unstoppable. They were perfect, or at least, that's what Edward thought. But love, no matter how perfect, is fragile. The foundation they built together, those shared moments of tenderness, held secrets only one of them knew. Secrets that threatened to unravel everything Edward believed in. At first, the cracks were almost invisible. A misplaced look, a fleeting hesitation in Anna's voice, the faintest shadow crossing her face when she thought no one was watching. Edward noticed, but he never questioned it because how could he? Trust wasn't just a part of their relationship. It was its very core, and Edward trusted her with all his heart. Yet, beneath the surface of their love, something else began to take root. It wasn't loud or obvious, it never is. But it was there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. In the end, love is never what you expect it to be. Sometimes, it brings light, hope, and a future worth dreaming about. And sometimes, it brings heartbreak so deep, you can't imagine ever recovering. For Edward, this was a love that would redefine him, not in the way he hoped, but in a way that would change his life forever. Edward grew up in a small town where dreams were often left unfinished. But he was different. He carried an unshakable optimism, a belief that love and hard work could shape the life he longed for. With his talent for painting and a heart full of ambition, Edward moved to Lagos, a city brimming with possibilities. It was there, in the vibrant chaos of a bustling market, that he first saw her. Anna. She stood out, not because of her beauty, although she was undeniably beautiful, but because of her presence. There was an ease about her, a charm that made people gravitate toward her without her even trying. She laughed as she haggled with the stubborn vendor, her voice carrying through the crowd like a melody. And for Edward, it was as if the world had gone quiet. He didn't approach her at first. How could he? She was everything he admired, but felt he couldn't reach. Yet fate had its plans. A misplaced bag, a kind gesture, and their paths crossed. She thanked him with a smile that felt like sunlight, and before they knew it, they were sharing stories over steaming bowls of jollof rice from a nearby vendor. That was the beginning. Their love grew quickly, naturally, as though they'd always been meant to find each other. Edward, with his shy, thoughtful nature, balanced Anna's lively, adventurous spirit. He painted portraits of her, capturing the way her eyes seemed to hold entire galaxies. She introduced him to her favorite songs, humming softly as they danced in their small apartment, forgetting the world outside. Together, they dreamt of a life filled with love, laughter, and the family they'd one day build. But love, as beautiful as it can be, never without its shadows. Edward didn't notice them at first. How could he, when he was so consumed by the joy of their relationship? But looking back, the signs were always there. The late-night phone calls Anna would step outside to take, her voice just low enough that he couldn't make out the words. She'd smile when she returned, brushing it off as a work call or a chat with an old friend. And Edward, trusting and kind-hearted, never pushed. He wanted to believe her. He did believe her, because that's what love is, isn't it? Trusting someone, even when the small voice in the back of your mind whispers otherwise. It wasn't just the phone calls. Sometimes, there were moments when Anna seemed far away, her laughter not quite reaching her eyes. She'd recover quickly, distracting Edward with a kiss or a question about his latest painting. And Edward, eager to keep their happiness intact, let it go. But there were other things too. A scarf that didn't smell of her usual perfume. A strange name that appeared briefly on her phone screen before she swiped it away. And the sudden trips, explained away as urgent errands or visits to her family. Edward told himself it was nothing, that he was imagining things. But late at night, as he lay awake, the question lingered. Was it all in his head? Or was there more to Anna's stories than she let on? For every moment of joy, there was a flicker of doubt. But love has a way of silencing doubts, of convincing you that the person you've given your heart to could never hurt you. And so, Edward pushed the questions away, choosing instead to focus on the life they were building. He didn't know it then, but every unanswered question, every ignored instinct, was leading him closer to the truth. A truth that would shatter everything. At first, it was subtle, the kind of changes you barely notice when you're caught up in the day-to-day routines of life. Anna started working late more often, apologizing with hurried kisses and promises to make it up to Edward. She claimed new responsibilities at work were demanding her time, and Edward, ever supportive, encouraged her. After all, wasn't this what a loving partner did? But the changes didn't stop there. One evening, as Edward prepared dinner, he heard Anna's phone buzz. Normally, she'd leave it anywhere, on the kitchen counter, on the sofa. But now, it was always within reach, always face down. This time, she answered it quickly, stepping out of the room with the vague excuse about needing to take a call from her boss. Edward did think much of it at first. "You know I can't keep this up much longer," Anna whispered, her voice low, urgent. The words stopped Edward in his tracks. What couldn't she keep up? He pressed his ear closer, but the conversation ended abruptly. Moments later, Anna Ray entered the room, her face calm, her smile as radiant as ever. "Everything okay?" Edward asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Of course," she replied, brushing past him to the table. "Just work stuff." And that was it. She didn't offer more, and Edward did press. But the question lingered. What wasn't she telling him? Days turned into weeks, and the small incidents began to pile up. Anna started canceling plans, dinners, weekend outings, even their regular Friday night movie routine. She always had a reason, a last-minute meeting, a family obligation. Each excuse sounded plausible on its own. But together, they painted a picture Edward didn't want to see. And then there was the scarf. A soft, silk scarf shed, tossed casually onto the sofa one evening. It wasn't hers, that much Edward was sure of. But more than that, it carried a faint scent, unfamiliar and foreign. Not Anna's perfume, not anything he recognized. He thought about asking her, but something held him back. A part of him did want to know the answer. So he put the scarf back where he found it and said nothing. But silence doesn't erase doubt. Late one night, Edward's restlessness got the better of him. Anna had fallen asleep early, her phone on the nightstand beside her. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest, as he glanced at the glowing screen. A single message lit up the screen. "Are you ready to tell him?" Edward stared at the words, his mind racing. Tell him what, and who was sending these messages? Before he could process it, Anna stirred. Quickly, he stepped away, his hands trembling as he tried to steady his breathing. Edward wanted to believe in Anna. He told himself that trust was the foundation of their relationship, that whatever was happening, there had to be an explanation. But trust can only carry you so far. And then, there was the night he followed her. Anna had said she needed to work late again. Edward nodded, smiled, and kissed her goodbye. But something felt different this time. He couldn't explain it, but the unease was too strong to ignore. He waited a few minutes, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the cool Lagos evening. He kept his distance, careful not to be seen, as he followed her through the bustling streets. When she turned a corner into a dimly lit cafe, Edward hesitated, staying back as he watched her through the window. She wasn't alone. Across the table sat a man, one Edward had never seen before. Their conversation seemed intense, their body language too familiar. And then, the man reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. And it didn't pull away. Edward's heart sank. He stood frozen, unable to move, unable to process what he was seeing. And yet, he still told himself, it could all be a misunderstanding. That somehow, this wasn't what it looked like. But deep down, he knew. The questions he'd ignored, the doubts he'd pushed away, were all rushing back now, demanding answers. And for the first time, Edward wasn't sure if he wanted to know the truth. It had been weeks since Edward's doubts began to consume him. He had confronted Anna, had demanded answers, had even brought up the cafe. Instead, he buried himself in his art, hoping to silence the questions that wouldn't leave him. But as much as he tried, the weight of uncertainty lingered like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing day. That evening, as Anna prepared to leave for yet another work meeting, Edward stayed behind. He told himself it was time to clear his mind, to focus on something, anything besides the thoughts that haunted him. Cleaning seemed like the perfect distraction. He started in the living room, carefully tidying the scattered sketches and canvases that filled the space. But when he moved to their shared desk, something caught his eye. A small, folded envelope, tucked beneath a pile of papers. He almost ignored it, thinking it was just another bill or receipt. But the neat handwriting on the front stopped him. It read, "To Daniel." For a moment, Edward stared at the envelope, his breath caught in his chest. Daniel, his closest friend, his brother in every way that mattered. What was Anna doing with a letter addressed to him? Slowly, hesitantly, Edward unfolded the paper inside. The words were neat, deliberate, and each one struck him like a blow. "Dear Daniel, you've always been my confidant, my safe space, my love. I never meant to hurt Edward. He's a good man, but my heart belongs to you. It always has. I can't keep pretending anymore. It's time to tell him the truth. Yours always, Anna." The letter slipped from Edward's hands, floating to the floor like a weight he could no longer carry. His mind raced, replaying every moment, every smile, every kiss, now painted with the knowledge of Anna's betrayal. And Daniel, of all people, it had to be Daniel. Shock gave way to anger, an anger so consuming, it made his hands tremble and his chest burn. He stormed into their bedroom, where Anna's clothes hung neatly in the closet, where her scent lingered in the air. He wanted to tear it all apart, to erase every trace of her. And Anna's voice called out softly, "He froze." He turned to face her, the letter now crumpled in his hand. His voice, low and trembling, broke the silence. "How long?" Anna's eyes widened as she saw the letter. For a moment, she said nothing, her lips parting as if searching for words. But there was no point in denying it. Tears welled in her eyes as she "How long, Anna?" Edward's voice rose, his anger spilling over. "How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been with him?" She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. And when she finally managed to answer, it was barely audible. "Years. Years." The word hit him harder than any blow ever could. The room fell into Chosdward's voice, shaking with rage, Anna's sobs filling the space. And the weight of the truth crushing everything they built. She tried to explain, to justify her actions, but nothing she said could undo the betrayal. "You were my everything," Edward said, his voice breaking. "I gave you all of me, and this is what you gave me in return?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," Anna cried. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," Edward replied, his voice now quiet, defeated. "You did just hurt me, you destroyed me." And in that silence, the weight of her words hung in the air. There was nothing left to say. Edward turned away, his hands trembling as he reached for the door. He didn't know where he was going, or what he would do. All he knew was that he couldn't stay. As the door closed behind him, the home they'd built together, the love they once shared, became nothing more than a memory, fractured and irreparable. And for Edward, The betrayal wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a pain he would carry for the rest of his life. Edward didn't say goodbye when he left. There were no final words, no parting glances. He simply walked out of the life he and Anna had built together, leaving behind the echoes of laughter that now felt like lies. The door clicked shut, and with it, the chapter of his life he thought would last forever. He didn't go far at first. A modest apartment on the other side of the city became his refuge, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts. The walls were bare, the rooms empty, but for Edward it was all he needed. For weeks, he barely left. The world outside felt too loud, too bright, too full of reminders of what he had lost. Instead, he turned inward, replaying every moment with Anna, every smile, every promise. He searched for answers in the past, hoping to understand how the person he trusted most could betray him so completely. But the answers never came. It was in this solitude that Edward found his way back to his art. At first, it was just a way to fill the hours, a distraction from the pain. But as the days turned into weeks, his canvas became something more. Each stroke of paint carried the weight of his heartbreak, his anger, his confusion. He painted a portrait of Anna first, not as she was, but as he now saw her. Her face was shadowed, her eyes filled with a sadness he had never noticed before. Then came Daniel, his closest friend, rendered with jagged, chaotic lines that seemed to slice through the canvas. Finally, he painted himself, a man standing alone in the rain, his silhouette fractured and fading into the darkness. The paintings were hauntingly beautiful, each one a testament to the depth of his pain. Word spread quickly among his peers, and soon, Edward's work was being praised as his most powerful yet. But the recognition meant little to him. For Edward, these weren't just paintings, they were pieces of himself, fragments of a heart still learning how to beat on its own. Yet, as the months passed, something began to shift. Slowly, Edward started to venture out again. He visited old friends, walked through the markets where he and Anna had once laughed together. The pain was still there, a dull ache that never truly left, but it no longer defined him. He began to rediscover who he was outside of the love he had lost. It wasn't easy. There were days when the memories threatened to pull him under, when he questioned whether he would ever feel whole again. But with each passing moment, he learned to lean on himself in a way he never had before. And in that self-reliance, he found a kind of freedom. What would you do if the person you trusted most broke your heart in this way? Would you let the betrayal define you, or would you find a way to rebuild? Is it possible to rebuild yourself after such a betrayal? Edward's journey teaches us that while the scars of betrayal never fully fade, they don't have to dictate who we become. In time, they can even become part of the story we tell about ourselves, a story not of loss, but of survival. And so, Edward's life continued. He did find closure, because closure isn't something that happens to us. It's something we choose to create. He chose to forgive, not Anna, not Daniel, but himself. For trusting, for loving, for being human. Sometimes, betrayal teaches us that the only person we truly need to rely on is ourselves. And that's where Edward found his strength. Not in forgetting what had happened, but in learning to move forward despite it. Betrayal cuts deep. It leaves wounds that time alone cannot heal. But just as Edward learned to pick up the pieces, perhaps we all can. Find the strength to move forward, even when the path feels impossibly heavy. Have you ever experienced betrayal like this? Perhaps it wasn't a lover, but a friend, a family member, or someone else you trusted with your whole heart. These stories of heartbreak are universal, yet each one is deeply personal. If you faced a moment like this, share your story in the comments below. You never know, your words could help someone else begin their healing journey. If Edward's story resonated with you, if it stirred something within you, take a moment to reflect. And if you found comfort or connection in this tale, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to this channel. Here, we explore the raw truths of love, loss, resilience, and the indomitable human spirit. In the end, life isn't about the betrayals we endure. It's about the strength we find within ourselves to rise again. As Edward walks toward his new beginning, let his story remind us all, healing isn't a destination, it's a journey.